Cellular respiration brain pop readings. In depth. Today, we know glucose as the main energy source for living cells, but our knowledge about this all-important chemical compound took a little while to collect, more than 200 years to be exact. Glucose itself was first discovered in 1747 when a German biochemist named Andreas Marggrave, pictured on the left, isolated and extracted the simple sugar from raisins. It wasn't until almost 100 years later, in 1838, that the name glucose was first coined by the French chemist Jean-Baptiste André Dumas, pictured in the center. The name has its origins in the Greek word glycos, which means sugar or sweet. As for the molecular structure of the sugary energy source, German chemist Emil Fischer, pictured on the right, finally discovered that in the late 19th century. Who knows what we'll discover about glucose in the 21st century? Famous faces. Sir Hans Adolf Krebs, a German-born biochemist who later became a British citizen, is most famous for identifying two important metabolic cycles, the urea cycle and the citric acid cycle. How important was Krebs's discovery of the citric acid cycle? Well, besides the fact that it was renamed for him, many people refer to it as the Krebs Cycle. The discovery of this vital stage in the cellular respiration earned Krebs a share of the 1953 Nobel Prize in Physiology. Just 20 years earlier, Krebs had been forced to leave his native country because he was Jewish. The newly formed Nazi regime barred him from practicing medicine in Germany. At the time, he had already established himself as a prominent doctor and a medical researcher. So after immigrating to England, Krebs was invited to join the biochemistry department at the University of Cambridge. There, he made his famous discovery of the citric acid cycle in 1937 and went on to have a distinguished career in his adopted homeland. Sports. Cramping up can be a real drag, especially when you're in the middle of lifting weights, running on the treadmill, or swinging a tennis racket. But what exactly is a muscle cramp? Well, it's basically a contraction of a muscle or group of muscles, and it doesn't happen only during exercise. Muscle cramps can occur while we're sitting or walking, or even when we're sleeping. A muscle cramp can be as harmless as a tiny tick or as painful as a severe spasm, and it can happen with pretty much any part of the body. When it comes to exercise, the most common muscle cramps occur in three muscle groups: the quadriceps, the hamstrings, and the calves. When these muscles are overworked, less and less oxygen reaches the muscle cells, forcing them to use carbon dioxide to break down glucose for energy instead. We call this fermentation, as opposed to cellular respiration, which uses oxygen to break down glucose. One of the main waste products of fermentation is lactic acid, which irritates the nerve endings of the muscle cells. As more and more lactic acid builds up, the irritation gets worse, and we feel this irritation as soreness and eventually cramping. Ouch. There's no surefire way to prevent cramps like this, but doctors recommend drinking plenty of water to keep hydrated, stretching before and after exercise, and drinking an electrolyte-rich sports drink after heavy exercise. Sickness and health. Humans and animals are aerobic organisms, meaning our cells use oxygen to break down glucose for energy. Anaerobes, on the other hand, don't depend on oxygen to survive. In fact, for some, the presence of oxygen is actually pretty lethal for them. These creatures are called obligate anaerobes, and they include some harmful bacteria that causes diseases you may have heard of. An example of an obligate anaerobe is Clostridium tetani, a rod-shaped bacterium that causes tetanus. That's the disease you have to get vaccinated against every 10 years or so. Another Clostridium perfringens, another rod-shaped bacterium that causes gas gangrene, an ugly condition that can destroy skin and muscle tissue. Neither of these types of bacteria would stand a chance if exposed to the amount of oxygen presented in the air. In fact, one of the treatments for gas gangrene is hyperbaric oxygen therapy, or HBOT. The patient is basically sealed off in a pressurized chamber and pure oxygen is pumped in. The bacterium Clostridium botulinum pictured can also cause severe problems when it's sealed off in an anaerobic environment. C. Botulinum can produce a deadly toxic called botulin, which can affect people who eat contaminated food. Though extremely rare, the resulting food poisoning called botulism causes a blockage of nerve function which leads to complete paralysis. Interestingly, though, it is one of the most lethal natural substances known to man. Botulin is the main ingredient in Botox, short for botulinum toxin, a treatment for things like muscle spasms and migraine headaches. But best of all, it's even used to paralyze facial muscles in order to get rid of wrinkles. Just around the corner. Did you know that you can breathe certain liquids just like a fish breathes water? First developed in the 1960s, special oxygenated liquids can keep you alive instead of drowning. What's the point? For one thing, breathing liquids would allow scuba divers to perform deep sea dives without the risk of getting the bends when gas bubbles enter the bloodstream after a dive. And in patients with lung problems, like premature babies and burn victims, breathing liquids helps get more oxygen into the blood. There are still a lot of problems with the technology, most notably that it's hard for human lungs to move liquid in and out inside of air. But a thick liquid called perfluorine is already being used in hospitals. And who knows, maybe there's a deep sea liquid breathing dive in your future. And a comic. I don't think cellular respiration applies to cars. And the person's holding oxygen and sugar.